Kurmanjan Datka, or Datka, is a movie from Kyrgyzstan from 2014. The director's name is Sadık Sherniyaz, and interestingly, it's his first feature film. It's a pretty epic, serious undertaking, right? For somebody who is just making their first movie. It is set historically in the 19th century during the Russian expansion into Central Asia. And it's based on a real figure, Kurmanjan Datka. She's also called Queen of Alai or Queen of the Mountains. And this is a national epic or historical biopic as a genre, we can call it that. It's a state-sponsored project which is meant to construct national memory and provide a founding narrative for the nation. And in a second, I'm going to tell you why that's important here. So as a state-sponsored project, you can see it's pretty, again, epic. And again, for a director whose first effort is this movie, this is a pretty huge accomplishment, partly thanks to the fact that it was very much supported, financed, and in all other ways by the state. It's the first full-length historical feature film made by order of the government of the Kyrgyz Republic during the years of independence, and it combines spectacle, landscapes, battles, costumes with moral storytelling. And what's important here is that there were no countries of Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan before the Soviet Union. They were Khanates, they were called, right? So Khan is a governor of a territory. And there were three major territories belonging to being these Khanates. And this is what the movie starts with, is these tribes or these nations, basically, or Khanates, fighting with each other or negotiating with each other, paying each other taxes, things like that. And these were not nation states. That's what's important to understand. All of these big territories and the Khanates, at least two of them were nomadic people. You know what that means, right? Nomadic. So they were tribes that were moving along the steppe and the desert and the mountains, and the nature there is not hospitable in many of those places. Some of it is extremely cold in the winter. A lot of it is, again, mountains or steppe, which means things don't really grow there, right? Like in terms of growing food, wheat, or things like that. So they had to be on the move. And that creates a whole different culture and a whole different society system and a whole different nation building dynamic. So then the Soviet Union came in through negotiations and through force and through all kinds of means, created these 5 republic states. And again, not really based on language or nation state lines that didn't exist, or religion, because most of them were Muslims. There was some Buddhism in there, but there was nothing very definitely defined, like in the west of the Soviet Union. Remember, we talked about that. The country of Ukraine and the country of Belarus and the country of Lithuania and Latvia. You could argue that those were ethnically, culturally, they were not homogeneous, of course. They were still multicultural, but they made sense. They were comprehensive as countries and states. And still they fight. And still there are border disputes between, Georgia and Armenia. Of course, there is a Georgian nation and an Armenian nation and Azerbaijani nation. And still they're fighting over their territories and all of that. But here in Central Asia, those problems and conflicts were kind of built in from the very beginning of the Soviet Union, because those were very arbitrary borderlines. And now it's very important for them to build that national identity. So building national identity is one of the biggest goals as a state for each of those states, and they address it differently. But now Kazakhstan made a movie that's a national epic movie, and then this year in Uzbekistan there is a movie that's coming out that's also a national epic movie. You see, both of them state sponsored, so that's definitely a trend, and you can understand why. So Kurmanjan Datka, it's not just a story about the past, it's a film about how Kyrgyzstan imagines itself today and wants to imagine itself today. And so, as a nation building from the country that did not exist in those borders with that name, like all of other Central Asian countries before the Soviet Union, that's very important. So, of course, there is a lot of feeling in it that it's a patriotic movie with a lot of ideology. Okay, so the 19th century Central Asia here is depicted as a region in turmoil. For centuries, the Kyrgyz had been getting steamrolled by one empire after another, just like all the other, of course, Central Asian countries, from Genghis Khan and Tamerlane until the 19th century. And then their territory had shrunk to like a fraction of what it once was. And the people had splintered into 40 separate tribes. Imagine 40 tribes, right, in one territory. And in the mountain town of Gulcho, I think it's called, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, where the film was actually shot, and it's depicted as Kurmanjan's historical town headquarters, kind of. Virtually the entire local population contributed to this movie as extras. And interestingly enough, many of the residents claim their descent from Kurmanjan herself, which could be true. I mean, it sounds funny. The whole town are her like great grandchildren, but it could be true because she was survived by 31 grandsons, 57 great grandsons. All right. So that's plausible. You could have a whole town related to her, basically. All right. And so the film becomes this like act of collective memory making because, yes, of course, she's a real figure. That's a known fact. But all of those details in that movie, other than the main historical facts that her husband had been the governor or aristocracy figure and he was killed and she inherited the title, those are historic facts. But most of the things in the movie are open to interpretation, mythology, like any history. Let me tell you, any state history is always full of mythology. So this is the collective memory making that that country wants to make. But of course, it's interesting that they decided to make it with this woman as the head of the historical memory. Now, how does this film differ from historical epics? The hero of the film here does not lead to rebellion. Now, if you think about epic historic movies that we are used to from the West and from America, from Hollywood, we've had plenty of historical epics, heroes leading rebellions against the English rule, right? All of those plots that are very common in the Western historical memory. Usually there is a rebellion, you know, the hero either dies or is tortured or something like that and is extremely brave. We don't really see that dynamic here, right? Of course, she's a very brave woman and she sacrifices a lot, and it requires a lot of stamina and ideology for her to fill that role that she was not supposed to be in and was not brought up to be in, right? But time and time again, we see that she chooses negotiation, compromise for the preservation of her people. And this is the most important idea that you can take away from that movie is their memory making and myth making is not based necessarily on the idea of a revolution, of a rebellion. It's based on the fact that the desire to preserve their identity and people at the price of compromise and negotiation, which is a very interesting idea if you think about a historical epic. Her central decision often is resistance versus accommodation. She has to choose whether she is able to resist militarily, and she does have some battles. She has to go to battle. Otherwise, it's just going to be complete surrender, right? There is no capitulation here, but you have to pick your battles. And that phrase, to have to pick your battles, I think is the main motto of this movie, which again is not characteristic of a heroic biopic. So the film builds toward the decision on not necessarily how to win, but how to survive with dignity. And maybe that survival with dignity is your victory. All right. The empire also is shown very interestingly in this movie. I mean, of course, these are small nations fighting against the empire. And that's always a history of all our civilization is that, empire versus local communities. But again, unlike in many anti-empire heroic films, the Russian Empire is portrayed as powerful, yes, as inevitable in a way, which I guess it was, but it's not purely demonized. It's portrayed as more pragmatic than ideological. The empire here works through local elites and negotiates control through intermediaries. And the reading that I gave you, Morrison, in particular, Morrison's article, it discusses that a lot about military conquest versus negotiations through the local elites. And so, as much as it's tempting to show your heroic history as a history of heroic military rebellion against the enemy, the empire that's trying to colonize you and winning that battle, they're not really doing that. They admit that this was a history of negotiations with the local elites, and the elites negotiated the best deal that they could for the nation. Of course, a very important topic in this movie is gender and power. It's one of the very rare female symbols of historic power, and even more rare in an Asian, Central Asian, Muslim country to have a woman in that role, and a woman as a symbol of the nation. And here, women are shown as carriers of cultural identity, of ethical center of the community. Of course, she's a woman in a male-dominated political system, like all political systems in the world. But notice how the movie starts with that myth about her dad, right? Her family arriving to the shaman, right? That tells them that this is a daughter that is worth 10 sons. For a traditional male-dominated patriarchal society, this is a very big deal to have as a myth. The irony of that scene was that the father came and asked this shaman, he complained that he doesn't have children. And the shaman is like, what do you mean you don't have children? What about her? Oh, but that's a daughter, right? So that gives you an idea of the attitude toward girls, right, in the society. And she gains authority through wisdom and through moral credibility, and also through restraint. And again, restraint is not something that epic heroes are known for, right? That's not how you become an epic hero, is by restraint. Well, she did. She is powerful, but also not a feminist figure per se. Like, that was my next question to you. Is this a feminist movie? Is that a feminist agenda? Can we look at Kurmanjan as a feminist symbol or figure? Like, probably it would have been in a Western epic of this stature. And I don't think so. I mean, she's not a modern figure in the Western feminist sense, right? She embodies tradition and authority. And she equates or she embodies personal sacrifice with national survival. Well, of course, first of all, we can see that in the fact that she basically sacrificed her son for the stability, for that compromise and that negotiation with the empire that we just talked about. She could have put all her authority and all of her reputation and everything into negotiating the release of her son. But for various reasons, she decided that that was not going to serve her nation well, that it would be a personal gain for her, but would somehow undermine the state of her negotiating for her people. And so that's one of the central tragedies of this movie, right? Is the personal sacrifice for national survival. We see a lot of local culture, nomadic culture, the yurts, these homes that they live in, the horsemanship, the seasonal migration. And interestingly, and that's part of the ideology of this movie, it's presented not as a primitive society, but is just another form of society structure, directly contesting the Soviet and Western hierarchies of modernity, which consider this type of society to be inferior, right, more primitive. And modernity appears both as an opportunity and a threat. So modernity is not clearly positive in this movie either. It's a matter of compromise. All right. And so the final thing that I'm going to say is this myth making and memory in terms of blurring the lines between a myth and reality. We talked about the fact that Baron Mannerheim, who later became a famous prime minister of Finland, but back at the time, he served as a diplomat for the Russian Empire. And so he was sent to Central Asia as part of the negotiation efforts. And this is him. And this is Kurmanjan Datka. Here, what's interesting is that in Western history, I mean, if you've studied history of Western Europe, World War II, World War I, you would know who he is. But in this movie, the person taking the picture together tells him, 100 years from now, if somebody knows you, it's from this photograph because you're standing next to this great woman, which is a pretty ironic situation because in the West right now, very few people know who Kurmanjan Datka is. Well, you do because you're taking this course, but many, many people know who Mannerheim is. And then he took this famous photograph of her. And this is, I just wanted to show you, this is Kyrgyz currency called Som, and Kurmanjan is on the currency today and has been since the independence of Kyrgyzstan. And so I will leave you with the question for this film is not only what happened in this movie, but why tell a story this way when it was clearly an ideological choice to make this movie. So why did they choose to make this myth this way and tell the story this way? And so this film is less about resisting the empire rather than how to live under it without losing your moral and national integrity. All right. Well, thank you very much.